said, we are Starkloff Disability Institute. We are the workplace disability advisors. And one of the things that we do is advise job seekers with disabilities on the most effective, efficient path towards getting a job. And today's topic is going to be 5 things people with disabilities should know about work. And this is for if you're looking for work, if you're thinking about work, if you currently are working. These are important things that a person with disabilities should be aware of. So first and foremost, you want to know what your rights are. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodations for employees and applicants. So whether you're currently employed or you're interviewing, businesses are required to provide reasonable accommodations. But what does reasonable actually mean? First of all, they cannot ask you if you have a disability. So an employer can't go, hey, I noticed you're in a wheelchair. What is that? What's wrong with you? Or do you have a disability that will keep you from doing this job? Or do you have any medical concerns that would keep you from doing this job? Those are all illegal questions. They can also not ask you about pre-existing health conditions. What they can ask you is to demonstrate or describe your ability to do the job with or without accommodations. And this can get complicated. So for example, if you are in a wheelchair, first of all, I should add, they have to ask this of everyone, but if you're in a wheelchair, you have an obvious disability, the employer is allowed to ask you, can you do this job? Can you demonstrate this job? They just have to ask it of everyone else. And this is most important for people with disabilities to know about work. Companies are allowed to negotiate accommodations. Your first accommodation doesn't have to be the one that they go with. For example, let me jump back for a second. For example, service animals. If you have a service animal, there may be another employee in the office with a disability that there might be allergic to the service animals. So what the employer is allowed to do is to say, well, what are the specific tasks that the animal is trained to help you do? And then they're allowed to look at that list of tasks and come up with alternatives to those tasks so that the animal doesn't necessarily have to be with you in the office as a potential health risk to another person. Now, if the animal has to be with you, then they might have to look at something like finding a different office for you to be in, or finding a different office for the other person to be in. But the point is, companies are allowed to negotiate with you about accommodations. By the way, you'll see the logo on the upper right for the 30th anniversary. If you're not aware, July is the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. As far as physical exams, sometimes you'll be asked to do a drug test or have a physical exam. Employers can request these, but they have to be after the job offer. So you'll get a preliminary job offer first, then you'll have to take the exam. That exam must be required of all employees, not just the people with disabilities, and what they're testing for has to be work-related. So for example, if you're going into an office to do data entry, it doesn't make sense for them to do a physical assessment to see if you can lift 30 pounds. As far as proof of accommodations, employers are allowed to request this. If you ask for an accommodation, they can ask for proof of what you actually need. This must be provided by a qualifying professional, so a doctor or a physical therapist, someone who can verify that you do indeed need the accommodation. The proof does not need to include a medical diagnosis or full medical history. It only needs to include proof of what you need. And it must be kept confidential by the employer, which brings us to another topic. Well, actually, before that, so let's talk about what we mean by reasonable accommodations. So as I said, employers are allowed to negotiate accommodations. Your request might pose an undue hardship or a direct threat and might conflict with the needs of another employee. So again, going back to that example of a service animal, you should be aware of what undue hardship is. It is an action requiring significant, difficult, or expense on behalf of an employer. So the example we use a lot when describing this is someone who is deaf who uses American Sign Language and needs an interpreter. It is perfectly reasonable to expect an interpreter to be available at major meetings, at job interviews, at large gatherings of employees. It is not reasonable to expect the company to hire an interpreter full-time. That is essentially paying 2 people to do one person's job. So that would constitute an undue hardship. There's also this idea of direct threat. An accommodation cannot impose a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodations. So, personal example, I'm legally blind. I will never be allowed to drive a forklift. It's not reasonable, it's not safe. If the essential functions of the job, or that I need to drive a forklift, and I come to work and say I cannot drive the forklift, unless they reassign me to another position, I basically cannot continue to perform that job. That specific duty cannot be met in a safe way. So that is what meant by direct threat. I also want to highlight this. Some of you, there's an image on the right. This is a picture of the voluntary self-identification of disability form. And it's interesting because this form shows up on a lot of job applications, and people ask us, well, wait a minute, they can't ask this question. They actually can. And before I get into that, I want to do a quick poll of our audience. If I can find how to do that. Here we go. When you see the voluntary self-identification form, do you fill it out? We'll take a couple of minutes to see what you all say. Okay. So let's share our results. As we can see, a good chunk of you, a little over 3/4, are filling out this form, but a quarter of you aren't. I think it's important to cover what this form actually means, because it can be a concern if you're not quite sure. So what the form is related to this Section 503 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. And what the act requires is for federal contractors to adopt affirmative action hiring processes. This form helps contractors assess their progress. Basically, by volunteering this information, you're helping them determine whether or not they're meeting their required goals as far as recruiting and hiring people with disabilities. The form is not supposed to be used or seen by any hiring staff, so the recruiter won't ever actually see this form. It goes to a separate part of HR, usually the compliance department, and it is kept strictly confidential. In fact, the way it is reported is in pure numbers. So, at the end of the year or the end of 5 years, the office that's responsible for administering this will ask, how many people with disabilities did you hire? And they'll say, we hired 7%. They can't give specifics. They're not going to talk about individual employees. They're not allowed to use this form in that way. Our logic here at Starkloff Disability Institute is because since there's a lot of pressure on federal contractors and subcontractors to hire people with disabilities, it's actually good if you disclose a disability to an employer, because for those employers, that's the only way they're going to find out. And if they're trying to have affirmative hiring practices, but they're not allowed to use this form, then there's no other way they're going to find out that a candidate has a disability and therefore should be receiving some kind of consideration. So we're going to pause just a second to see what kind of questions we've had so far. But I first want to get to section 2. We've talked about what the law says as far as accommodations. I want to talk about the next thing you as a person with a disability need to know when thinking about work is, if you're going to go into the accommodation process, you need to know what you need. So specifically, what specific accommodations will you need for this job? And the way you determine that is you look at the essential functions of the job description. So with the Americans with Disabilities Act, it says that accommodations have to be provided so that employees can perform the essential functions of the job. The essential functions are the basic duties that must be met. Going back to the example of the forklift, as I said, the essential function is that I be able to drive a forklift. If I can't do that, then I cannot perform that job. So when you're applying for jobs, when you're considering jobs, you want to be able to identify from the job description what all the essential functions are, and then determine what accommodations you might need. So will you need assistive technology? Will you need an adjustable work schedule? Will you need a flexible work schedule? Will you need an alternative working environment? Sometimes it's even just understanding from a supervisor that the way you learn and train can be at the same pace, but has a different form than the average person. As we tell our employers when we're consulting with them, what is more important? Is it the outcome or is it the process? So that is something to think about as well. Let's stop and see what kind of questions we have.
Jason, we have a couple of questions, and they're related to each other. So I'm going to read it over to you.
I'm looking at them right now. We've got 3. What is the best approach if you have an invisible disability that could impact your work? Do you not bring it up in an interview? I plan on talking about that. That's actually our next slide. We've also got, what about something like a seizure disorder? That is a good question. We do have a couple of candidates we worked with who have seizure disorders, and it does pose a bit of a risk if you have a seizure and your employer is not aware of how to respond to it. If you have a seizure disorder and you're operating heavy machinery, then and you have a seizure and your employer doesn't know, they're within their rights to punish you basically for operating without disclosing a serious health condition, because that does impose a direct threat. How do you disclose that you have a seizure disorder? That's a difficult question, but usually it might be in the form of a list of what to do given to the supervisor if you do have a seizure. But it also involves making sure that when you're applying for jobs, you're thinking about, all right, what are the situations in which I might have a seizure? Is it safe for me to be there if I have a seizure? You might disclose that to your supervisor, that this is what could possibly happen, and they may choose to take that particular duty away because it poses an undue risk, a threat to you or your fellow coworkers. If you're wondering about the gray screens, that's because I have the Q&A open and it's blocking the screen share. All right, great questions so far. Keep them coming. And I know we had talked about disclosure planning. So this would be number 3, have a disclosure plan. Be prepared to talk about your disability. Now, people always wonder, does it actually help to disclose a disability? Sorry, that was my clock falling off its mount. It actually can. As I mentioned, first of all, with federal contractors, they're actively trying to hire people with disabilities. Disclosure empowers the recruiter to help you. So I do this little math whenever I'm talking to someone about disclosure planning. The average recruiter for a large company is probably doing 100 or so interviews in a year. That's a completely unscientific guess, but they're doing a lot of interviews in a year. Hiring managers maybe do like 10 to 20. And so the hiring managers really rely on the recruiters, and the recruiters really rely on you. the recruiter is going to go to the hiring manager and say, I've got this great guy or great woman who's coming in, and they're going, these are all their talents. They've disclosed that they need this accommodation. This is how they're going to use this. Hiring managers will have questions about how your technology, your assistive technology, your accommodations will help you. Your recruiter is the best person to help negotiate and navigate that conversation with the hiring manager while you're still in the hiring process. A disclosure ensures the law is followed. Remember that accommodations have to be provided for job interviews as well as for jobs. If you need, like for example, a typing test, if you're visually impaired and the job interview involves a typing test, disclosing that you need that as an accommodation ensures that you're able to take the typing test and be considered at the same level as the able-bodied people taking it. So disclosing ensures that the law is being followed. It does challenge assumptions. Let's be honest. Most interviewers assume that when you walk into the room, you're able-bodied. And we do know from talking to dozens of recruiters over the years that if they expect an able-bodied person to walk into a room and a person in a wheelchair or a person with a white cane walks in, their first thought is, did I follow all the laws? So disclosing beforehand if you have a visible disability, or if you have this category of semi-visible, which we'll talk about in a second, that can help refocus the employer and get around any unconscious bias that's going on in their heads. If you have gaps in your work history because of disability or in medical experience, a medical emergency, disclosing can help explain those gaps. This is one of the biggest challenges that people with disabilities often have when they're seeking employment, is that many people have significant work history gaps. A couple of rules to follow though: never start with disclosure. Don't walk in and say, hi, my name is Jason Hartsfield, I'm legally blind. There is such a thing as protected status, and that can be a bit of a flag to employers. There are people who assume that they're going to get a job because they're a member of a protected status. No one ever got a job out of pity. You've got to make sure that you're talking about your qualifications first, then disclosing your disability. And again, we'll talk about that in just a moment. And finally, only disclose what they need to know. If I'm interviewing for a job, they don't need to know that I've got ocular albinism and that it's been present since birth and da-da-da-da-da-da. What they need to know is that I'm visually impaired and I have certain requirements as far as being able to participate in an interview and being able to do my job. They don't need to know any more than that. They don't want to know any more than that. So that's also something to keep in mind. So how do you disclose? Be brief, honest, and job relevant. There are 3 broad categories of disabilities. Your first is going to be your visible disabilities. And this is, I'm in a wheelchair, I'm using a white cane, I use American Sign Language. The best time to disclose something like this is when the interview is being scheduled. And that goes back to our point about not surprising the interviewer. You've got the interview scheduled. Guess what? They're not going to revoke that interview. They're going to keep doing it. So you've had the phone interview, and now they're in the process of scheduling. You can tell them after all the other details are met, oh, by the way, I need to know where the accessible parking is. I'm going to be using a wheelchair. Oh, by the way, can someone meet me at the front? I'm blind and will need a guide. That's the best time to disclose that, because even if you don't need an accommodation, you're still letting them know that they're not going to see an able-bodied person coming in. There's this middle category of semi-visible, excuse me, and this is an interesting category. There are disabilities that manifest in ways that the average layperson is not familiar with. A good example might be if you have flat affect, which can accompany certain disabilities. If you are autistic and you have a different speaking style, if you have a speech impairment, if you have some kind of nervous tic or behavior that you engage in, people don't often automatically associate those with disabilities. So how do you disclose that? we've found the best way to do it is to nip it in the bud. When you show up, you shake their hand, you say, nice to meet you, you sit down, you're ready to talk, you say, oh, incidentally, I may seem antsy, I actually have a disability that causes me to twitch a little bit. Please disregard it. Or I know I can talk very quickly, I have a disability that affects my speech pattern, please disregard it. And the thing is, with employers who know the law, the moment you break out that disability word, a switch is flipped in their head that basically says, I'm not allowed to ask any more about this. But it is a great way to just put it out in the open, get it out there, and move it on. The last thing you want them to do is look at your behavior and draw conclusions about you personally. You don't want someone, if you have flat affect, you don't want them saying, well, this guy's not very enthusiastic about being here. Sure he is, he just can't physically manifest it, can't present it. So disclosure, if you feel like you're in this category, disclosure in this way can help. And finally, your invisible disabilities. These are things that the employer is going to look at you and not be able to identify at all whether or not you have a disability. So chronic health conditions that don't really manifest, such as diabetes, if you're in the process of battling or are a cancer survivor. Some versions of low vision, some versions of hearing loss, even some certain mobility impairments, they may not manifest. So the question you want to ask then, do you need an accommodation for the interview? Do you need an accommodation for the job? If you don't need an accommodation for the interview, you don't have to disclose during the interview. If you don't need an accommodation for the job, you don't ever have to disclose at all. So it goes back to telling the employer what they need to know. All right, let's talk about number 4, how to recognize and respond to discrimination. This is an important one because disability discrimination still very much exists, but for a lot of people, it can be difficult knowing how to respond to it. So discrimination in the context of civil rights law is unfair or unequal treatment of an individual or group based on certain characteristics. So discrimination, you have to treat it as a legal term. And there are several different categories. You've got age, disability, ethnicity, gender, marital status, national origin, race, religion, sexual orientation, and several others. So what I want to do now is invite you in the chat to answer a few questions. I'm going to lay out 3 scenarios, and for each one, I would like everyone to tell me yes, no, or maybe. So the first one is, an employer asks a blind applicant how they use a computer. So in your chat, just throw on yes, no, maybe. Let us know what you think. We're seeing some in the Q&A. Scott, are they able to use the chat?
Yes. They should be able to. That's okay. We can pull this out of the Q&A.
Yeah, I'm getting some mixed yes and no's. So the answer is actually it kind of depends. The ADA does allow employers to ask job-relevant questions if the person's disability is immediate and obvious. So they can ask you specific questions about how you, as a person who are blind, do you use adaptive technology or software? That's really kind of a job accommodations question, but it's not overt discrimination. Now, I know a lot of HR professionals out there who would say, look, just don't ask this question, err on the side of caution. But you as the employer need to know what you're going to talk to the hiring manager about. You as the employer need to know, all right, I need to know if there's specific software I need to download. I need to know how I'm going to make sure that you're getting the accommodations you need. That's a legitimate question. Okay, second one. An employee is passed up for the last 3 promotions despite being qualified. Do we think that is discrimination? Scott, it says it looks like we've got a couple of people saying the chat box was disabled.
It should be working now.
Okay.
Yes.
Maybe not necessarily, depends on the individual. We got one person who says yes, we've got another person who says maybe. Maybe there's a lot to consider. Maybe. Yeah, you're right. Maybe there's a lot out there. So the first question you want to ask is there an observable pattern? You know, are there, can you look at the last three people and say, well, the last three people are able-bodied white men. And I'm a member of this identity and no one else in the office is getting promoted as well. The other thing you want to ask is, are they actually qualified? So this is a tough one, but it's important to keep an eye out because this kind of thing does happen. All right, last question. A coworker's making mean-spirited jokes at your expense. Is this discrimination? Could be yes, absolutely, yes, or harassment. Yes, yes, yes. So we've got a really good group here, Scott. So this is where we get into the idea of a hostile work environment. And the legal definition, you know, thinking about the legal explanation for a hostile work environment, it's not just people are being mean. It's people are actively creating an environment where you cannot do your work. So a hostile work environment is created by a boss or coworker whose actions, communication, and behavior make doing your job impossible. And it must be discriminatory in nature. So we have to look back at those protected groups. But the great thing is the ADA basically says if you can be perceived as disabled, then you can be discriminated against based on the ADA. But yeah, I mean, as a supervisor, as a manager, if you know you've got employees who are making jokes, you know that that's contributing to a hostile work environment, you put a stop to that right away. So if these kinds of things are happening, how do you respond? First, we always advise if it's reasonable and safe, follow the corporate chain of command. So if a coworker is making mean-spirited jokes, talk to the supervisor. If the supervisor is making those jokes, reach out to human resources. If you jump too quickly to an outside complaint, it can actually make things worse for you. So if reasonable and safe, follow the corporate chain of command. Document everything. So this is the thing, about 95% of these kinds of cases are either settled or lost. So having documentation on this day, so-and-so said this to me and such was there. This day at this time, I observed this. That documentation can be really crucial. So make sure you're documenting what you're observing. If you need to, contact the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. They can walk you through the process of how you go about filing a complaint. And if you need to, seek outside counsel. You might want to talk to a discrimination or disability employment lawyer. Okay. And finally, all of these things we've talked about get much easier when you're using your network. So what do I mean by that? I mean the people in your life, your professional contacts, your colleagues, your family, your friends. These people can be really helpful in helping you do all of the other things. Identifying what your best disclosure strategy might be, identifying accommodations, identifying resources for if you suspect you might be discriminated against, navigating how to plan for your job interview. Your network can give you all kinds of information. They can provide job leads, they can give insider knowledge, they can provide professional and personal support, references, resources, and never underestimate the value of mentoring. And I'll say this too, never underestimate the value of being a mentor. If you are someone who's doing well, if you're someone who is a professional with a disability, there are a lot of other people who could really benefit from your knowledge. I've seen it work, it's amazing. As far as internal referrals, recruiters are 15 times more likely, according to a 2016 study, more likely to interview a candidate with an internal referral. And we would argue if you have a disability and you have an able-bodied person advocating for you, you're more likely to get that interview. That's been demonstrated as well. So use your references, use your contacts. We've even had some experts tell us they don't even apply for a job at a company if they don't know someone who works there, because it's far more likely that you're going to get that interview. So I want to ask another poll question real quick. How many people are actually networking right now, are actively networking? Okay. So we're close to a bit of a split, but majority, 63% of you are actively trying to expand your network, and that's great. Networking is the most important thing you can do as a professional, especially if you're job searching, but even if you're not, you should always look for that opportunity to build your list of professional contacts, people who are going to go to bat for you, people you can go to bat for, because networking is a two-way street. All right, so how do you grow your network? First of all, start with the people you already know. Family, friends, teachers, co-workers, supervisors, everyone around you. Talk to them. Let them know that you're looking to expand your network. If you're job seeking, let them know that you're looking for a job and what they're looking for. And then find out who they know. Find out who they can introduce you into. Turns out you'll have a much bigger network than you might have realized. Alumni associations and professional associations. If you can be a member of a professional association or your school's alumni association, those are good networking opportunities. Networking events, job fairs, Toastmasters, those are great ways to make new contacts. Social media, especially LinkedIn. I am a huge fan of LinkedIn. Like somewhere around 90% of employers say they like, recruiters say they like LinkedIn. It's an incredibly useful tool for growing your professional network. Don't underestimate the value of volunteering. Going out there and proving your ability to do your job can make it even easier to get those referrals and get those references from your network. And finally, again, don't underestimate the value of mentoring. Don't underestimate the value of being a mentor. In short, networking opportunities exist everywhere you can meet new people. Don't ever underestimate the power of networking. So, resources you can use. First, we've got the Job Accommodations Network. I know we said one of the things that you want to do is know what you need. Well, if you don't know what you need, or a new position or a new duty has come upon you and you're not quite sure whether or not you'll need accommodations and what accommodations you'll need, visit Job Accommodations Network. They've got resources for employees, they've got resources for employers. We have ada.gov. It's the federal government's Q&A website for if you have a question about the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They can give you an overview of everything that they do, how they can help you if you fear that you might be an observer of or a victim of discrimination. Finally, for those employers in the group, the Office of Federal Contractor Compliance Programs offers a full description of kinds of resources for if you have disabled employees, if you need to meet your obligations as an employer. I encourage job seekers to be familiar with this as well, because you can definitely use it to your advantage. All right, and once more, I'm Jason Hartsfield, Adult Career Services Coordinator with Starkloff Disability Institute. I encourage you to visit our website, www.starkloff.org, or give us a call at 314-588 7090. We are perfectly equipped to walk you through how to plan your job, how to plan your disability disclosure. How should you approach an interview? How should you expand your network? That's what we specialize in. We also work with employers. How can you create a better recruitment strategy? How can you create a more inclusive environment for your employees with disabilities? That's what we do. That's what our expertise is in. So now we'll look at our Q&A and see what kinds of questions we're getting.
Jason, while you look at the Q&A briefly, Sherry asked if you could maybe put the slide up again with the protected groups.
Okay.
And then it looks like we do have 2 or 3 questions in the Q&A.
Okay. So is it this slide, Sherry?
I think that's the one that she was looking at.
Okay. I apologize to the interpreter. I know I go too fast. So the first question we have, what if I feel I have experienced discrimination during the interview process? Great telephone interview and I was qualified, but asked about wheelchair ramp and never heard back. So that's a tough one. You often don't know why you weren't given an interview. And so that's, again, why we say wait until you've got that offer for an in-person interview. Because really, a lawyer would have a hard time proving that not getting asked for an in-person interview is not necessarily discrimination. There are a lot of reasons why people don't get interviews. Even when they do have a good interview, they still may not get asked. It's just really hard to tell. So our advice would be wait until you've got an offer for an in-person interview before you ask about something like that. I walk with a cane. Should I disclose that on the application? Again, I would encourage you to wait until you're meeting with the person in person to talk about that. You might even think about, are you walking with a cane? Why are you walking with a cane? What does the employer need to know? On your application, they need to know, for example, if you use a video relay and they're going to call you for a phone interview, you might apply for the job and then call the HR office and say, I use a video relay. If someone is going to call me, please make sure they're aware of that. Because we have had people who are deaf or who use video relays get hung up on. So that might be something to disclose in the application. But as far as a mobility disability, I wouldn't disclose that. Okay. Is it an acceptable, reasonable accommodation to ask a personal assistant for a totally blind, let's see, is it acceptable, reasonable accommodation to ask a personal assistant for a blind candidate until adapting to the work environment? So what you're asking about is what we call orientation and mobility. And I would say your best bet is to connect with a nonprofit or a federal government office or like a state government office like Rehab Services for the Blind or the Society for the Blind to request orientation and mobility training. When we talk to recruiters and employers, they run into a lot of problems with things like job coaches or mobility trainers because they just show up without realizing that that is an accommodation request. That has to go through a formal process with the employer. But it is a reasonable request. You need to know where you are at your job. You need to know how to get around. Now, as far as getting used to the job duties, you might want to let the employer know that, for example, you're using a new computer system, but you're using it with JAWS. There probably will be a learning curve for you. The employer needs to be aware of that and needs to account for that while you get started with your job. What are some specific ways that you recommend to grow my network? That's been upvoted. So again, identify some professional associations, have a really good LinkedIn account. I always tell people though, the best place to start is make a list of everyone you already know. Parents, siblings, kids. If you've got adult children, they know people, friends, teachers, co-workers, supervisors, people at church. Start with a list of them. Go up to them and say, hey, I'm trying to grow my network. This is my profession. This is what I'm looking for. Do you have anyone you could recommend I connect with? Who should I talk to? See who they introduce you to. And get used to asking that question as you meet with people. Hey, who do you think I should connect with? But again, LinkedIn is a great resource too. You can start with connecting with people you already know. Look at who they're connected with. We actually have a webinar on our YouTube page with Jim Burney from Washington University talking about how to use LinkedIn, and I recommend you look that up. Starkloff Disability Institute on YouTube. It'll be pretty easy to find. Do you have a case for complaint if you were hired for a certain job, but the job description changed due to a change in management or some other environment, i.e. burnout by caregivers in assisted living place, especially if they don't give you an updated job description? That's a challenge. That is a challenge. I'm not a lawyer. It's not legal advice. What I would recommend, so first of all, a lot of states, especially including Missouri, they're allowed to just change your job duties. So you might want to talk to the EEOC about that. I'm not in a good place to provide specific advice on that. Do you work with people outside the St. Louis area? Do you work with people nationwide? We are expanding. We're trying to expand to work with people from outside the St. Louis area. We've worked with people on the East and West Coast. Definitely being able to, in this world of virtual communication, we've gotten much better at that, much more well-equipped at that. I'm going to roll back to the last slide, by the way. So yeah, reach out to us. Go to www.starkloff.org. Click on For Candidates, and there will be a page that you can fill out an inquiry form. What if you have a semi-disability and not completely aware of what accommodations you might need? Lack of self-awareness. If you're not sure what accommodations you might need, I would say start with what your diagnosis is and then go to the Job Accommodations Network website and look and see what they say. So if you've got a learning disability, for example, just off the top of my head, they've got a page on that. They've actually got a full list of recommended disability accommodations. If you've got the ability to talk to an occupational therapist, that might help too. But it also comes down to what the specific job duties are going to be. So if you're going into a position that might require you to do a certain thing that you need an accommodation for, then you could look at unique ways to do that job with an accommodation, or rather look for the accommodations that you might use. How about an online course? So thank you, Lori, that's a good one. On September 8th of this year, we are going to be doing our our first ever virtual capstone course. So Starkloff Disability Institute does this in-depth 10-week course on everything you need to know about how to get a job, how to get a career as a person with a disability, because careers and jobs are very different. We meet for 6 hours a week, 3 hours Tuesdays and 3 hours Thursdays. We'll do it over the internet through Zoom conferencing. We bring in employers, we bring in guest speakers, we go over everything from how do you answer the question, tell me about yourself, to how you write an amazing cover letter, how do you plan for, we don't think it's bragging when we say we can teach you how to plan for any possible job interview question. So we strongly recommend, if you're really interested in that, look at our website, send us an inquiry form. Again, it will start on September 8th, and it will go for a good 10 weeks. Well, about 85% of the people who take this course go on to get a career that they want. So we really recommend, if you're interested, give us a contact. We also want you to check our booth out today at the expo. We've got a lot of resources. We've got You're going to get a toolkit from us as well. So make sure to visit our booth at the expo today. Do we have any other questions? We've got one more. What if you have MS with multiple disabilities? Again, it comes back to the same thing. Look at what the essential duties are of the job. Look at what your accommodations might need to be at Job Accommodations Network, and then figure out, is this something that I need to disclose immediately because it's visible? Or not immediately, but before the interview? Is this something I need to talk about right as the interview is starting because of a semi-visible disability? Or is this something I need to talk about at all? If I don't need to talk about it at all during the interview, I'm going to wait until I have the job offer. Scott, I haven't been looking at the chat. Have we had any questions coming in through it?
I think that is mostly it. I don't see any additional coming in through the chat at this point. Do you want to do you want to tell them about, we've got another session, the one that Blair and Danielle that they're doing this afternoon, if they're interested in that?
Why don't you, Scott? I didn't do my homework as well as maybe I should have.
I gotcha. We've got another session this afternoon at 1 o'clock. You can access that by, it would be probably in the same email that you received to sign up for this, or if you want to, if you're coming in through the expo side, go to our booth and you can sign up there. It will talk about our youth transition programs aimed at our high school kids and young adults in college, and we'll have some additional resources there. So if you want to check that one out, we'd love to have you. Jason, we've got one more question that just came in on the Q&A.
Use a wheelchair due to decline in ability and need accommodations. So again, it's the same thing. If you're in a wheelchair, you might want to tell them after you've scheduled the interview that you're going to be coming in with a wheelchair. If you're, and this is actually a really good question because it gets to this idea of declining disabilities. Thank you so much for asking it. So accommodations are a fluid process, just as disabilities are a fluid process. We at Starkloff say disability is the one identity you can enter into at any time. The older you are, the more likely you are to become disabled. So if you live long enough, you will be disabled at one point in your life. So if your disability changes and you need to modify your job accommodation, approach your employer and talk to them about it. But it's extremely unlikely that your disability will change significantly during the interview process. So only really focus on disclosing what you need to get through the interview process. Again, only give them what they need. So again, after you're employed, I would say approach your supervisor, find out, explain to them that you're having a disability that is changing, that you need an accommodation, and work with them to figure out what you need. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We love getting this information out. We're open to helping anyone who wants to contact us. Again, visit www.starkloff.org, STARKLOFF, or dial 314-588-7090. I've been Jason Hartsfield with Adult Career Services Coordinator here at Starkloff Disability Institute. I'll show my face again just so if you call, you know who you're talking to. We have another person too. She's actually the founder of the Career Academy, Susan Menhard. She's listening in. So there are two of us that would be able to help you out if you contacted us. So don't hesitate if you have any questions to give us a call or drop us a line through our website. All right, Scott, anything else?
Yep, I think that just about wraps it up. Again, thank you everyone for attending. We appreciate it. Get a hold of us. We'd love work with you more. I'm going to give a quick shout out to our interpreting service, MTNA, and we also our captioning service, ACS. Thank you so much for working with us on this presentation.
Yeah, and visit our booth at the expo.
Absolutely, please go there now. All right.